everyone, and welcome to Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole. It is a new year, and I'm so excited to be here with you. We will have some of the most outstanding guests and conversations to inspire you, to provoke you into just leaping into your best self all year long. And today is no exception. We have a very special guest who has written a number of books, including one that has just come out right now. I want to tell you about her. She is Ijeoma Oluo. She is an influential writer and advocate renowned for her powerful voice in addressing feminism, racism, and social justice. She calls herself a writer, speaker, and internet yeller. We're going to ask her about that. Her impactful work, including the best-selling book, So You Want to Talk About Race, and contributions in Time and The Guardian and many other publications, have earned her recognition as one of Seattle's most influential people and the Route 100's 100 most influential Americans. Today, we're going to be exploring her remarkable journey and insights, especially in light of her recent release, Be a Revolution: How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too. And this book hit bookshelves on January 30th, 2024, right now. So join us as we discuss her impactful career and gain insights from her profound work. Welcome, Ijeoma.
Hello.
Hello, and congratulations on all of the great work that you have been doing. We appreciate your scholarship and courage, really.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So you call yourself an internet yeller. What does that mean? You know, we live in the age of the internet, and people use it in lots of different ways. That is a very intentional, provocative thing to say. What does that mean?
It's something I've had in my bio for a very long time now. And for me, it was kind of this way of playing with this idea that people just yell on the internet.
Mhm.
I am of the opinion there's a lot of things to be yelling about. And I, like many other, I think, Black women, was able to find space in social media, in internet spaces, to be heard, where I wouldn't have been otherwise, and
Mhm.
really was able to build a career in stating these things that were upsetting me and saying I had a right to talk about these things and to talk loudly about them. And so kind of taking this thing that people, would say, all you do is yell at the internet, yell at the internet, as if it's not a space that exists, as if it doesn't influence people and doesn't have an impact. I was like, you know what, let me just add that to my bio. Might as well.
Uh, people use the internet for lots of reasons. Some it's just an indulgence to be the ultimate distraction. And what you do is provoke people to think and push buttons and really uh, challenge the status quo in many instances. What if you had to pick one, and this is always hard if you have to pick one, but could you pick a moment when you made a very strong statement recently in social media, and what kind of reaction you got? If there was a really powerful reaction, what would an example of that be?
Oh, I mean, there
I
are a
know,
lot,
I know.
um, I've been speaking out a lot about what's been happening in Palestine. And that was something that was an immediate, and I knew because I have spoken about this in the past, there would be an immediate response. And at first, the response was incredibly angry. People were feeling very provoked, people were feeling very indicted. And then people started to see more of what was happening and started coming around and saying, wait, what was this thing you were talking about earlier that I wasn't ready to hear? And it was pretty wild to watch, this onslaught, that, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of comments from people, as I'm trying to add context to what is happening. And then as people were learning on their own and going out and maybe, being angered enough to do a little Googling, realizing, oh, wait, there is a real conversation to be had here, and coming back around to it. So that's definitely, I'd say, one of the more recent examples. But even I was talking about parenthood the other night and how we define families, and how we use language in ways that can be really harmful to children and to
Mhm.
parents, in viewing children as possessions and not autonomous people.
Mm.
And even the conversation around that was really beautiful. From parents who maybe hadn't considered how they talk about these things, but also children who had watched these conversations and were able to discuss the impact of these conversations on their lives and how they saw themselves.
And how important is that? So let's look at both of those because I think that they are valid uh, topics to dig into as it relates to Palestine. And I appreciate your saying how things change. In the very beginning, I mean, I remember because of parents at my daughter's elementary school. She's now in college. Who one family lives in Israel, and they came here quickly when everything broke out, and of course tensions are high, feelings are, I mean, people are scared, upset, all the things, and people got in their corners, and it's a, it's a really tough conversation because it feels like no matter what you say, you're going to be in trouble. There are landmines everywhere, right? And then, as you say, over time, a lot of information has come out, making it far more complicated than one might imagine. you know uh, so one of a how what advice would you give to people who feel like they're kind of caught in the middle? Well, I have like these parents who I love who are like completely anti-Palestine because they are living in Israel and feeling the fear and pain and horror, and others who are looking at the laundry list of things that have occurred uh, in violation of the Palestinian people, and conversations aren't really happening. What advice do you give to a parent, to regular person? Like this book is talking about regular people. What do you tell regular people to be able to have an informed conversation and not feel like they're roadkill at the end?
That's a great question. I would say first and foremost, it's really important to realize that a lot of the division around these topics are orchestrated. They're on purpose. So a lot of times people will think it's natural. So people will look at an issue like Palestine and say, "Oh, it's complicated. That means it's unknowable,"
Hmm.
without recognizing that the reason why it's complicated is so that we will feel like it's unknowable, so that we will feel like we couldn't actually make progress and come together, that there wouldn't be something that multiple people from different demographics would have in common or be able to move forward on. And so I would say recognize that and ask, why is it so complicated? Why am I constantly being told I couldn't understand this thing, that there's no way I could be able to speak upon it? Who benefits from this very cut and dry language? Because the truth is even if you're looking at someone with an opposite viewpoint of you and you're saying they are completely wrong and they are the problem, they're the reason why they think that way is by design. And
Hmm.
someone else is doing that, just like someone else is responsible for what you know or don't know. And so recognizing that and then saying, what are the mechanisms here? And instead of saying, I need to convince this one person something differently, say, why do they think what they think? Who benefits from them thinking what they think and saying what they say, or being unwilling to hear me, being unwilling to join me in conversation? And then I would also say, just recognizing the power structures at play and your own sphere of influence within it. We try to reach so far outside of our sphere of influence, and we'll rage at the president. And I get it. I absolutely get it.
Right.
But maybe having a conversation with the teachers at your local school is more effective right now. Maybe finding that and saying, okay, maybe I can't get my parents to stand with me completely, but I could maybe ask them some questions about how things are set up in Israel, how they feel locally from a political perspective, or why they feel the way they do, and maybe do a little research into, is there an entryway in there where I could say, hey, have you considered this, that maybe you were told this to forward this narrative, or maybe we could at least recognize that this is something we can work on. And if not, then say, okay, I'm going to set that aside. Where do I have people I can align with? Where do
Hmm.
I have people I can work with? And move forward in that space. We have this idea that we have to win over the hearts and minds of everyone on every issue we disagree with. And what we really need to do is activate with the people that we can find common ground with and move forward. Otherwise, we'll just spend all day arguing because people benefit from saying, oh, no, you can't move forward until you agree on every point on this. Oh, you have to just keep fighting. And they'll stoke those flames. And instead we say, you know what? Okay, I see you, and I see that you don't want to join me in this part. I see this person here that wants to join me in here, and we're going to move forward. And I'm not targeting you, I'm moving forward.
Well, and you write in your book about being in the movement. Movement being, I mean, that's a word that we don't often unpack, but it's illustrative of what you just said. Like, well, who are you going to move with? You know, you cannot necessarily, you can't move everybody, you can't move everybody with you, but you get to choose with whom you will move.
Mhm,
Now, speaking of these landmines, and you wrote about this in on your social, Claudine Gay,
mhm.
first Black woman to be president of Harvard. You know, folks were so proud of her that this had happened. Uh, Gone, you know, and she made some comments on Capitol Hill that were considered incendiary. Uh, well, her reaction, her reaction to what was asked of her. Um, why do you think this happened? Do you believe that it's racially motivated? Do you think, based upon the constructs that you talk about in your books of, you know, how our society is set up, that her leaving, her forced departure, is grounded in racism?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This was definitely, I think, a two birds, one stone moment
Hmm.
for the powers that be. One, to send a chilling message through academia for those who not even would say anything themselves in support of Palestine, but would even just support a space for Palestinian students and allies to speak out.
Hmm.
But also a chilling message to those who would hold space for the ways in which students are challenging academia, right? So students aren't just saying, you know, support Palestine, free Palestine. They're saying, hey, school, how much of your money is going to this, right? And that's a different question that has a lot of people, you know, alarms raised. But at the same time, they're also recognizing this is a community of color led moment. And that when it comes to leaders in community of color moments and how we talk about racism and power and white supremacy and all of these things, that Black people are leaders of this. And
Hmm.
targeting the Black community in these moments is a way to shore up power in the United States. And then you just have people who were like, absolutely, if we can make an example of a Black woman, who's going to fight us? Who's going to say no? And we can deal a real blow to anyone in the Black community who feels like they can take a stand or rise above their station on any issue. And so this, I think, across the board just pleased so many people. And you're seeing this even with the celebration of people like Christopher Rufo, who, you know, has done so much incredible harm to education across the country. That this was clearly a targeted thing. This was not, we're offended by this. It's, we're going to see what damage we can do to Black people in academia, to Black people in society. And we're going to leap at every opportunity we can to use this excuse to push any Black people who, even if they're not outspoken, who would even just their presence symbolize the empowerment of Black people. We're going to take this opportunity to make sure that they're pushed
It,
out.
is there anything, Ijoma, that you think she could have done? Coalition building, anything else that might have protected her?
No. I don't think so. I do think that it is a shame that when it came to discussions of unions at Harvard, that she was not more pro-union. And I do think that she could have had far more support. I think it would have been a much harder battle for people to push her out. But at the end of the day, I still think they would have done it.
Hmm.
And so, you know, I'm certainly not trying to put any blame on her for what happened. But I will
Hmm.
say this, the things that we often sacrifice, the compromises we make to these power structures because we think it will buy us another day, are often the things that will ensure our defeat and will make sure that we are alone when we're defeated. And so that's where, you know, I do hope that Black people and other BIPOCs in these sort of positions who are thinking, maybe I am going to try to stifle union activity here. Maybe I am going to do this because it will, you know, curry favor with people who could help me out, they're still not going to help you out at the end of the day. And the people who would are going to be further disempowered by those choices that you made. But at the same time,
Ooh.
they really did have a target on her, and that they were going to try anything. And we saw it because they were grasping and reaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hey guys, this is Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole. We are talking with Ijeoma Oluo. She is the author of 5 books, I believe it is, including the New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race. Today, she has a new book. It is called Be a Revolution: How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too. Ijeoma, this book is chock full. I mean, wait, how many pages are in here? Almost 400 pages about thereabouts. First of all, I love your writing, because even though you look at a book that's this big and you go, oh man, and it's about race, oh, is it going to be heavy? It doesn't feel heavy. The writing is welcoming, which I certainly appreciate. And then there's so many stories, examples, because I think a lot of times people think about race and tragedy and sadness and loss, and is it even worth the fight? Sometimes people feel, because just like you said, if there's a target on your back, one day that target practice is going to work, right? There's hopefulness in your book. And can you talk about how you find hope, and the people that you interviewed? There's so many stories in here. How do people find hope in the midst of being in the movement and fighting the good fight?
Thank you for that question. I would say that this book represents a lot of education for me personally on how that's done. And it was also a turning point in my life, because I think even in my writing, I had reached a point where I couldn't continue to just spend all day steeped in white supremacist violence, that it was really taking a harmful toll on me. And it was really important that as I wrote the book, wrote it from a healthier space. But I learned how a lot of the ways from talking with people who had been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, and watching how they sustain. I think a lot of times when we think of movement work, we think about this work that happens in these crucial, super painful moments, right? We're talking about people activating around George Floyd. And that does bring a lot of people to the movements. But what we don't talk about is when that stops making headlines, work is still being done. And we know that because we're here, right? We exist. And we are finding ways to come together and even thrive. And what does that work look like? What does that everyday work look like? And talking with people and talking about their journeys when they were maybe in a less healthy space around the work, and then asking, what brought you to a healthier space, or people who are in the process, and what are you reckoning with right now, so that you can continue to do this work for a long time. I think that those sorts of things were really, really important. And for me, a lot of what it comes down to is why we do this work. We can easily focus on what we're fighting, but the question of what we're fighting for matters. And when we're fighting for community, when we're fighting from a place of love for ourselves and for our community, then how we live while we do this work really does matter. And I think that was really important to realize. And I think throughout the book and people's stories, that came up time and time again.
There are a number of stories, really poignant stories, from people who are and who have been in some way part of the criminal justice system. So many people who have been incarcerated, who are telling stories of how they've lived and what they have done in order to fill their souls, help other people. And as I was reading a number of these stories, Ijeoma, I thought, we often look at statistics, the statistics of how many men of color in particular are incarcerated. And we hear about the prison industrial complex. And this seems like this massive thing with these stats, but there's also shame. So, almost every Black family, I'm going to guess, and probably folks of color in general, has somebody, if not more than one somebody, in prison, or who has been in prison, but we don't talk about it. And because we don't talk about it that much, these stories are really eye-opening. Wow, there's all kinds of incredible good work going on that is saving people's souls and hearts and helping them to organize around community. Why was it so important for you to dive in and share? And what are you hoping that sharing these stories will do for the reader?
Thank you for that. I think part of why it's important is, yeah, absolutely. We are all touched by this. So many people have been incarcerated, have family, loved ones that have been incarcerated or are incarcerated. It is such a huge part of our communities. It's a huge part of our stories. And even as a Black woman, right? And the way in which we think of Black women's identity, of the
Mhm.
people who will carry the load, and while grieving, while mourning, and the additional responsibility of caring for families that have been torn apart by the prison industrial complex. All of this is a huge part of our story, and yet we are told that it's shameful to talk about it, and that ending up there is our fault, and that the people who end up there are fundamentally different from us. And yet it could be it's our sons, it's our partners, it's our fathers, it's people in our lives, in our community. And recognizing that, and then talking about not only why people end up there
Mhm.
and how it is a part of this system, how it is a continuation of chattel slavery, but then also that they're still people and their stories don't end. People still exist. People are still worthy of love. People are still capable of growing and learning, and they're creating it themselves. And the amount of strength, the amount of pride we should actually have in what people are able to build in these horrific conditions, because prison is torture. And yet
Mhm.
they're still saying in this, when they've been cast aside by almost all of society and told their story ends here and that they are of no value, are not only finding value in themselves, but finding value in the people around them and working together to say, even if I stay behind these bars, I choose how I live here. And I choose how I grow here and how I see myself here and how I insist on being seen. And when we look at that as an extension of broader society and the ways in which communities of color have been so externally defined, that is something we can actually learn from. So much of what we try to do is to make sure other people see us in a particular way without saying, I have the right, no matter what anyone says about me, to say who I am and to build with my community and to say, this is what my community needs to look like. And a lot of prison abolitionists and a lot of people working within the prison industrial complex who have been targeted by the prison industrial complex are doing some of the most revolutionary work we have.
You mentioned the word abolitionist, and I found it really fascinating. There's a section in your book about what does abolition mean, and the fact that, I mean, even if you didn't learn much in school, you learned about abolition, but it was from the 1800s. It's Frederick Douglass. There are a few names that people know, even if they didn't get much history class. You're talking about abolition today. What does abolition mean to you? What are we abolishing? Who's in that struggle? Because this is like active today that you're talking about. And I don't think that most people understand that as an active concept in 2024.
Correct. Yeah. I think first and foremost, a lot of people don't realize that the project of chattel slavery never ended, that it was shifted into our prison industrial complex, and that from that we built all of our major systems. We built these carceral systems where people are locked away, and not only locked away, but labor is extracted from them. That we continue to steal land from people, that we continue to lock people up against their will, we continue to force people into labor against their will at little or no pay, that all of our systems are funneling people actively into this. And so I think that first and foremost is a thing that we don't talk about. I think as a Black woman, and I'm sure that you've heard this as well, people telling you, get over it, slavery ended, so and so, years ago.
Exactly. Like my family isn't. I didn't do it, and it's so long ago. It doesn't. What are you talking about, right?
Right. And these same people will be, voting on quote unquote law and order bills that they know will lock up majority Black and Indigenous people. Right. And so that, letting people say that this ended and it's not connected is incredibly harmful. And so recognizing that, and recognizing that these systems are intertwined, recognizing how easily chattel slavery was then cemented into our systems and turned into this vast system of exploitation, not only in the United States, but also how we steal land and support the oppression of people across the world, right? Recognizing that means we have to be aware that all of these systems that do this are a threat to us, and that we can actually do the work of freedom wherever we attack on a systemic level and say, absolutely not. We will not exploit people. Anywhere people can be exploited, anywhere people can be incarcerated away, anytime we say people are irredeemable, that people are built for this particular labor, that, people can't exist with us, that we are basically continuing this story that started with chattel slavery. And so where we fight that, we are actually continuing to do the real important work of freedom. We are standing next to the abolitionists that we learned about in, elementary school and middle school.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love reading it, and just it reignited something within me that this work is not just in the past, and that we can take pride in standing up and for each other. And I think one of the things that has happened culturally, I think in your work you describe by design, as people gain more power, more influence, more money, and move into different classes, you can get removed from you think you can be removed from some of the perils of systemic racism. There's a story that you have about Ian Head in your book, who is a white male. And I appreciated that you talk to him, because often we think that the work is only for Black and brown people. And the fact is, it's got to be for everybody, or else it's not going to work. But what he talked about, which I think is interesting, especially at this moment in time, is that his education was through hip hop music, that he learned, because he's one of those people who wasn't, he didn't grow up as a Black man. He didn't grow up in poverty. He didn't have some of the challenges that many other people have had. But by listening to the music and learning the stories, he was activated and empowered. Can you address his story and also the impact that hip hop has had on consciousness?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a beautiful story. And when I was talking with Ian and he said that to me, I got emotional in the conversation, because it underscores something I think that came up time and time again in talking with people, which is there is nothing more powerful than a true story. And hip hop itself, being an indigenous Black American, right, is indigenous to Black American culture and history. This art form carried, in the breasts of enslaved people, to tell our stories, to continue to tell stories, even when people were punished for doing so. And we have to remember that too, that even hip hop is demonized. It's so much in our society, and yet so much of it is rooted, especially underground hip hop, in telling stories that we don't often get to hear. And it is so powerful. And a story told to music, a story where you have every aspect of it really contributing to giving voice to something that you don't often hear, can activate people in a way that, reading it in, a newspaper may not. And listening to that and knowing that, I am married to a hip hop artist. I see how much love and pain gets poured into that art form, and how often people are derisive of it. And knowing that it's still making a connection to people, and that people are listening to this and saying, this story is true. And I'm choosing to stand with people. And I want a different story. I want better stories. I want happier stories to come from this community that's given so much. And I hope people understand our art is not just about entertaining people. It's not just about a thing that you can, bop to. It is our stories. And it is why we survive. It is why we know our history, even when it's not in our history books, right? And I think that that's something that we really do have to value more.
This is Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole, and we have the honor right now of talking with Ijeoma Oluo. She has written a new book. It is called Be a Revolution: How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World and how you can too. One of the things that is true about you, Ijeoma, is you're biracial. Your mom is white, correct, and your father African. Um, as a woman growing up in this country of mixed race, let's start with how did you identify as a child? Because you're like on the border of when people were saying mixed race or just look, you got black blood, you're black. How were you identified as a child?
Oh, black, 100% all the time.
Mhm.
And especially, I would say, not only growing up in the time I grew up, but growing up in Seattle, where there were
Mm.
very few black people. If you're the only black person in your classroom, you're black. Like there is no other conversation around that.
Right. You're not light skinned enough for folks
Yeah,
to
no.
go. Is there a question?
Right, they're like, "Light skin compared to what?" And
Right.
so, as a young child for me, I mean, I was the darkest person most of the kids had ever seen, and we were absolutely called the N-word in class. We were absolutely targeted in that way, and as I got older, I had to really recognize, as I moved into spaces that had more Black people, that's when the relative privilege of being lighter skinned, of having a white parent, started to really show itself. And I had to really do some learning around what that looked like and how that impacted, my space and my perspective in life.
I watched a video where you talked about your mother and an interesting relationship having a white mom being a revolutionary as you are, and the education that happens even when people love you. And I thought it was so powerful. And I'd like for you to address this it about your mom, but just even in a broader context. Many of us, I'll say, have very close relationships, very close loving relationships with white folks who are family, feel like family. And then there are those moments where it's like, what did you say? What do you think? How could you think that and be my friend? How could you think that and be my mother? How is it possible that there's so much love that we have between us and there's so much ignorance?
Mhm. That's a
You
great.
you have a front row seat to
I
this. Can you
do.
talk to us about it?
I do. And it's interesting to me because, I'll have white people show up in my comments and be like, "How dare you say that I'm
Mm,
racist? I do this." And I'm like, "Look, I grew up around whiteness. You can't fool me. I know what this
mm,
looks like." But also it is hurtful. I mean, and there's still moments where, my mom will say something and and it hits your heart. And you're like, how I am 43 years old. How are we having how are we still having to have these conversations? And what it's a reminder to me, one is how deep and thorough the project of white supremacy is, right? That indoctrination is so deep that it can actually transcend love, that you can love someone deeply. And my mom would, put herself in front of a train for us. She loves us so deeply and was, to many definitions, very pro-Black in how she raised
mhm.
us, right? She wanted us to know we were Black. She wanted us to be proud. She loved that she had Black children. But did she know how white supremacy worked? Did she know her role in it? Did she know anything other than what she saw in like PBS specials? No. And does
Mhm.
that show up in how she acts and often things that she says that can cause real harm? Absolutely. And so for me, I think it's so important. It was really important as I started to do my work more and more, and I saw my mom reacting in ways where she was starting to feel threatened by how outspoken I was, that I decided I wanted a continued relationship with my mom, but I needed it to look a particular way. And I needed to offer that vision to her. And I would say one thing that's so important is there is so much fear with the people we love of other races and ethnicities that if we discuss these issues, that means the death of our relationship. And so
True.
stating like, I want it to look like this, because I think we know more than anything what it feels like to be comfortable. We know those moments where we feel safe and comfortable with someone, and we know who we can trust and who we can't. And I think offering that to someone who doesn't feel, they don't feel that unsafety every day. They only feel it when you want to talk about issues, right? And
Mhm.
so then they're like, all of a sudden, everything I thought I knew about this relationship is at risk. It's all over. And what you're saying when you're bringing up the conversation is, I want to feel safe with you all the time. I want to feel like we can talk about this. I want to feel like we can work things through. So with my mom, it has absolutely been a process of constantly reevaluating and saying, okay, this hurt, and I don't want this to happen again. What do I want to happen? And offering that and saying, do you want to join me? If you do, we have to work through this. We're going to have some really uncomfortable conversations, but I want this for us. I want us to move forward. And that's difficult. And sometimes people don't want to. Sometimes people will say, you know what, I don't want that. That seems like too much work. But a lot of people will want to. And they maybe just didn't have the vision before and they didn't know it was possible.
And have you had moments in your family or otherwise people who are close to you where you just realize, I just have to stop? In order to be in any kind of relationship with you, I have to stop having this conversation. Has that happened?
Not necessarily we have to stop having, there's people where I've decided we're not having this relationship, right? I have decided for myself to be a whole Black woman in every space I enter into, right? And that is a condition of being in relationship with me. And where I find that I can't and people aren't willing to work toward that goal with me, we're not in relationship. And I see them at, weddings and funerals. We nod,
Right.
we smile, and that's the end of it. And I'm not demonizing them. I'm recognizing the limits of what they're willing to do or able to do. And I'm saying, I am worth more than subjecting myself to this regular pain and disappointment. They know where to find me. Should they want to grow? Should they want to change? And we're not fighting about it because that's energy I don't have. But it was painful. It's painful nonetheless. I have people, a cousin who was like a brother to me, who lived with me growing up, who I have not been able to be in contact with because as many opportunities as were offered up for him to grow and learn and find a new relationship with me and my siblings, he didn't want to. And I had to decide, what my value was and what statement I was making about my value by continuing to subject myself to that sort of pain with, when he wasn't willing to put forth the barest amount of effort. And, that is hard and painful. And we're told we're not allowed to do that. Absolutely, I would say Black people and other people of color are told the burden's on us. We're not allowed to say, I'm not trying anymore. I'm putting my efforts elsewhere. We're not allowed to say my, safety and sanity is actually worth more than your education right now. And you can go out and find that on your own and come back to me when you're ready. And we need to recognize that that's actually a white supremacist statement about our value, that we would put out and put out and put out and put out all this effort and all this pain for people who don't even want to be uncomfortable.
Well, nobody wants to be uncomfortable. I mean, if we could not be uncomfortable, I'd be happy with that. It's not an option, but I think nobody wants to be uncomfortable. I think there are people who get to be comfortable, who, they believe it's their right and they enjoy that right. They revel in that right. And I think that a lot that you're saying in your book is, nope. So now you say in the book, you can too, how everyday people are fighting oppression and changing the world and how you can too. So Ijeoma, for regular folk, this is the beginning of a year. And so often people are thinking, I hate that term New Year's resolution, but they're thinking, what can I do that is putting my stake in the ground that matters for my life? And if this is an election year, what can I do this year that could have impact? Like you mentioned, rather than taking on the whole world, what is in our world that could be impactful? What can people do?
It's such an important question. And I think it's where we can do such amazing work. I would say for people who are brand new and saying, I just don't know where to start, first, look at your interests and look at your skill set. What are you interested in? Because race is in everything. Race is in absolutely everything. And I know, because as someone who's written popular books on it, I get emails from everyone in every sector. So if you love knitting, race is an issue in knitting and who gets their patterns published and who gets represented. And you can absolutely decide you're going to look in that space. If you're a biologist, if you're an environmentalist, if you are interested in childcare, if you're interested in education, all of these races in aspect of all of this. And so I would say, start with your interest, your skill set, where your kind of locus of power is, and ask what's happening here, and do a little research. What are the racial dynamics in this space? What haven't I been hearing before? And if you are a person of color and you're wondering, you can start with, what are people from my community saying in this space? Or what are people from other communities of color saying in this space? And so look at that. See what people have been doing. See what people have been asking for. See where you have different experiences based on race or ethnicity. And then say, okay, this is my area of expertise. This is where I have some power. Now let me ask those primarily impacted how they would like me to use it in their, in service of this. And it's a great way to start. And if you begin and end there, which is something Tarana Burke said too, if you begin and end in your little sphere of influence, you're still doing absolutely amazing work.
Mm-hmm. I think of, there are these pivotal points in history, one of them obviously being George Floyd's murder, right on the heels of the pandemic. And it between social media and the pandemic, it got folks thinking in a different way. And we know millions and millions of dollars were sent to businesses across the country and beyond with the presumed intention of helping in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And now, I guess this is 4 years later, a lot of these businesses are like, well, I checked that box. I gave that money. And many of the people who are the DEI leaders have lost their jobs. This is not a focal point the way that it was before. We did it. I've heard people literally say this to me. We did it. We're not doing that anymore. We've done the work. Now we have to do the work of whatever our business is. And with the economy being not as strong as it was several years ago, people are focused on the bottom line, and they often could care less about DE&I. How do you think that is impacting our world, our work? Do you feel that the clock is going backwards? Where do you feel that we are?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's always these cycles, and they always happen. And I think that it would behoove us to be prepared for them. Anytime that we can make any kind of measurable progress, the backlash is real and hard, because we have systems of power and people tied to the systems of power who are going to feel the threat. So we saw millions of people activated to fight for Black lives. Yeah. And it shocked and terrified a lot of people and a lot of power structures. And the moment that the cameras kind of were off them, they regrouped and said, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And that happens every time. And if you study our history, it happens every single time. And in ways that are subtle and in ways that are incredibly violent. And so we saw, after, the civil rights movement was no longer in headlines, we saw the mass incarceration of many movement leaders, right? We saw the hyper capitalization of getting people to say, we saw this idea of, if you became a doctor and a lawyer like the Cosby family, you would probably never have to really address racism in your life. And maybe just let it go, maybe focus on that instead. And then you don't have anything that you really have to fight for. We saw the, re-entrenchment of racial division within unions. We saw all of these things kind of happen to make sure it wouldn't happen again. And right now what we're seeing, I think first and foremost, because so many young people were leading this work, is the, destruction of the empowerment of young people in our education system. And we're seeing this from kindergarten all the way through college. And we need to know that and be prepared for it, because for a lot of people, especially people of privilege, they were activated by feelings of outrage and fear. It was the first time they may well have felt like they couldn't escape the realities of racism. And they wanted to do something to feel better. And then when they felt better, they're like, oh, phew, I did that, and let it go. And then realizing that the threat that many white people and people who have been manipulated due to skin tone privilege and economic privilege felt by that uprising, they still felt it, and they were still willing to do the work. And they were doing really simple things that we could have been countering. We could have been showing up at school boards and saying, you absolutely will not remove education on race and ethnicity from our schools. You absolutely will not remove these departments on equity from our schools. This is not going to happen. And made them reckon with us as well. And we didn't. And
Mhm.
it's important to know we still have time to do that. We still can do that. We still can show up. And we have to, because there will never be progress that we'll be able to make that won't be hard fought and that we won't have to pay for. It's going to happen every time, because they're not going to just give up easily. They're not going to be, oh, okay, you know what, here's that freedom that you've been fighting for 400 years. You can finally just have it. They're going to fight us, to their dying breath. And we have to be prepared and willing to say that our love for each other and for the goals that we have as a society is stronger than that.
This is Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole. We are talking with best-selling author Ijeoma Oluo. Her book, Be a Revolution. Be a Revolution. That's active, y'all. How everyday people are fighting oppression and changing the world, and how you can too. Ijeoma, I want to go back to the action that we can take now and point out the election, because you just mentioned something that's so important. I'm going to say many, many, many people do not vote in the midterms. They don't pay attention to school boards. They think that the presidential election is the only election. And so you just pointed out, no. In fact, the midterms could potentially be even more important. But we do have an opportunity to cast our vote. Now, there are people who will say, well, there's no real candidate for me. Nobody is really standing up for what I believe in. We have good reason to demonize certain folks who are running for president. But I think a lot of people are apathetic because they just go, well, what are you going to do for me? Whoever you are, what are you going to do for me? What can we do to activate folks? What can people do to have their opinions matter if they don't see it on, whatever the website is for the candidate who may seem like the best choice? What can people do to feel like their vote actually will count because they can have a voice?
That's a great question. And I would say, there is a lot of truth to the frustration people have, especially on a national level, right? We aren't being represented, and we're seeing issues where the vast majority of Americans want a particular move, and our government says, no, we don't want to do that. And we know you're going to vote for us anyways, right? And
Mm.
so that it is really important to recognize that. And I'm not going to try to gaslight people and say, actually, it's totally different. No, that's true. But there is a lot more on our ballots than just a national office, and we have to engage with all of it. We have to be strategic. And that also means reaching out to other communities and saying, like, we have activist groups who know clearly what's on the ballot that will help and what's on the ballot that could cause serious harm to communities. And doing a little bit of research and saying, even like I care about education. So I'm going to ask my teachers groups of color. I'm going to ask my teachers unions. I'm going to ask my parent groups of color, what matters to you that's on the ballot right now? Who do you really think we need to be paying attention to? What referendums do we need to be paying attention to? And you'll be surprised at some of the connections, some of the things that you thought that vote didn't really matter for, that you could be making a huge impact. The more local we get with our vote, the more powerful our vote is. And so a lot of times people get discouraged because they think, if I can't affect who's in the White House, my vote doesn't matter. But the truth is if you can affect where, school levies, your vote is so important. If you can affect who's in school boards, if you can affect where tax dollars are going in your city, in your town, that really matters. If you can affect who your, election officials are, who actually decides which votes get counted. So many things end up on ballots around cash bail, so vital, around, around education and funding and equitable funding for education, so vital. A school board, as I said, superintendents, important. Every bit of tax money we spend for infrastructure is vital. And look beyond your space. If you're in a privileged space and you're like, I have sidewalks, I have buses, and I can't impact the president, therefore this vote doesn't matter to me. You're not just voting for your block. How does your decision on these levies and these funds impact people who maybe don't have the same privilege you have? And so looking at that, picking an issue, looking at the groups who are actually doing this work, who are often doing the work to fill in these gaps, and saying, hey, what's on the ballot that you're really focused on right now? What are you trying to get past, or what do you need to not get past? And concentrate there. And then, make whatever practical and pragmatic decisions you need to make further up that ballot. But fill it out. Fill it out, because there's an immense amount of privilege in being able to decide, whether or not a particular city block gets sidewalks for kids to walk safely to school.
It's really that simple. And you can use the internet. Going back to you being an internet yeller, you can use the internet to learn these things. Can you just quickly can you point to any organizations that would be helpful for people to learn as they are preparing to vote?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I would say. One, I have ADHD. It's very hard for me to remember the names of things right off the top of my head. But
Okay.
what my partner and I do most elections is, one is we look for local groups who are doing the work. So we always look at teachers unions and we say, who are they supporting? We look at labor unions and say, who are they supporting and why? And we read through it, because we aren't going to always agree. We aren't going to always say this matters. And then we also look for explainers that often align with our values. So local abolitionist voting guide, local progressive voting guides that will explain what these terms mean are really, really important. I always try to pay attention to anything funding related, because a lot of support of the prison industrial complex is really hidden in funding bills. And they'll say, we're going to build this great thing. Also, we're all, going to put a little bit of money to lock up kids in jail, and it'll be kind of hidden in there.
Right.
And so reading that and recognizing, oh, this doesn't sound as good as it seems. And so looking at those local orgs that have been doing the work, women's rights groups and interpersonal and domestic violence groups are also a great place to look. They will always speak out if there's something in legislation. And then disability rights groups, disability justice groups are always a very, very important place to check, because so many bills impact our disabled community, often in really negative ways. And it never makes headlines. And that is something we need to be aware of.
Thank you so much for your commitment to uplift us, to support us. And this book has so many incredible stories that help people to see what are folks doing today to have an impact. And I really do believe that as I've been reading it, I see, okay, if he could do it, so can I. So can my neighbor. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be poor. You just have to be committed. And your book definitely is an incredible source of inspiration for that. So congratulations on your new book, Be a Revolution. Thank you, Ijeoma Oluo.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us here at Dream Leapers. I hope you pick up a copy of this book right now. You will enjoy it. And also, it's something that you can talk with your family and friends about. Turn the TV off, read a passage, and talk about it, and see what comes from the magic of your ideas, fueled by some really great research and stories. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.